There are so many amazing cultivars that exist in the world of horticulture, and I think it's important to talk about what a cultivar is just in brief. A cultivar is a clonal copy of that plant that we love. So if in your garden you find a seedling camellia that has all the attributes that you want to propagate it by taking a stem from that plant,
yes,
and either vegetatively propagating it by a cutting, so we could take this cutting, dip it in a rooting hormone, put it into a potting soil, put it into a greenhouse, and then perhaps it would form adventitious roots. Well, now this plant is going to be clonally identical to its parent.
correct.
Or we could use air layering. We see that a lot of times with Japanese maples and many other difficult to propagate plants.
Yes.
But of course, grafting is what has dominated the industry for many, many years, especially if you go back 80, 100 years. That was the way it was done. And you've been grafting plants for how many years now?
60 years.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So, and that's your method of choice for propagating camellias, and you've been kind enough to offer to show everyone how it's done.
Glad to do it, Eric. This is a Bob Hope. We talked about that earlier. So
right.
I'm just taking this cutting. Camellia people call it a scion. I am the scion of my dad. This is the scion of Bob Hope. This will be the one and only Bob Hope DNA when it takes on the graft. I use a Sasanqua, which is not a beautiful plant to most people. It's a pretty camellia, but it's a hedgerow basically. But it's root rot resistant, and it's a hardy grower. So that's what I call the mother plant. I've shaved off exposed my wood by an angular cut 2 ways, and I'm exposing the cambium layer, or the growth cell layer of the plant. I've done that on my sign of Bob Hope. I'm now going to soak that in some fungicide while I cut my mother plant. And what I'm going to do here, I'm preparing to make a cleft graft, a cleft incision in the mother plant. And what I'm doing now, Eric, is exposing the cambium layer.
Yeah, the cambium is only a few cell layers deep, and so it's that little layer between the phloem and the xylem, and that's actually what translocates the nutrition from the rootstock to the top of the plant.
That is correct. And the cambium layer between the phloem and the xylem is the growth cell of the plant. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a cleft graft now with my knife. I'm going to take the blade of my knife right below the cambium layer, about 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to use some growth hormone. Some people don't do this. I've done it for 60 years because my dad did it, and I have about an 80% success ratio, sometimes 85 if I'm lucky. And so I'm still doing the same thing. I've done it for all these years.
It's not broken.
It's not broken, don't fix it. That's my theory. This is just standard hormone you can get in any store, any hardware store on my rootstock. I'm going to line my wood up. I'm going to open it with the blade of my knife. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in angularly, so I cross the cambium layer. It used to be when I first started grafting, Dad would put it straight down and try to catch the cambium layer.
Right.
If you put it in an angle, Eric, there's no way you're going to miss the cambium layer, and that's why I put it at an angle.
Right, it just improves the probability that those little, 3 or 4 cells deep, actually that green on green has to touch.
That is exactly right. And then I bring the end of the scion out the other end of the cut, and I actually run my finger across it. And see, that has crossed the cambium layer of the scion with the cambium layer of the mother plant. Now, for added tensile strength, I put a rubber band. Some grafters do not do this. I do it just about every time because my dad did it.
Right.
You'll hear that several times. Even though I'm in a greenhouse, we're going to put this in a little small greenhouse out of this styrofoam 32-inch cup. I'm going to build a base to my greenhouse with wet sand. That does 2 things. It's a foundation to my greenhouse, and it retains moisture for the plant. Now, one big thing with camellia lovers is identification. As soon as I cut off this scion from Bob Hope, I wrote Bob Hope under the highest leaf. And then I'm going to, on my greenhouse, put Bob Hope, as I've done here, so I'll always know exactly what this graft is until it sprouts growth. Under this greenhouse, I tell people to give it about 8 weeks, and the growth is going to come out of that growth bud if it has taken. And then we'll cut a small hole in the top of the greenhouse with a pencil. That growth will go to the sunlight in that hole. As it starts bumping the top of the cup, I'll actually cut that hole out larger and larger, so the top of the cup will eventually be cut out totally. I'm going to cut these leaves a little bit so the growth will be growing to the growth bud and not to support the leaves.
Yeah, that limits transpiration or the water loss through the leaves, so you help keep more of that water inside of your cutting.
That is exactly right. Now to see how I want my sun to do the photosynthesis deal on top of the leaves, so I'm going to orient this pot toward the morning sun. So I'm using my Bob Hope signage to show me where those leaves are pointed toward the sun, okay? Some people will go 6 weeks. I say let it, if it's growing, it's going to still be growing in 8 weeks.
Right.
Give yourself 8 weeks. And all of these pots you see around this greenhouse, I've got about 100 now. I'm waiting 8 weeks.
Yeah, so there's an art and a science to it, but as we can see, it's not super complicated, and just with practice and trial and error, pretty much everyone can learn how to graft their own plants.
Absolutely, and it's a great pastime.
Absolutely, great.